Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Fantasy Fangirls Podcast, where two sisters dive deep into beloved fantasy lore, characters, themes, theories, and more.
For today's bonus episode, we're taking a short break from Navarre as we interview the best-selling author, Jennifer L. Armentrout.
I'm not screaming, you're screaming.
You know her as the author of the From Blood and Ash and Flesh and Fire series. She just released her 69th book,
Nice.
Fire in the Flesh, which is the third book of the Flesh and Fire series. She is a queen of dark fantasy romance, and we are so excited she's joining us on our show today.
When we got that email, I'm pretty sure I threw up in a corner. I was like, there's no way this is real life. So we are so excited. We're so jazzed to have her on the show. Before we start the interview, however, slightly different content warnings than usual.
Today's episode is mostly spoiler-free.
No real plot spoilers from Jennifer's books are uttered in this conversation. We talk in very general terms about characters and locations, but there are no plot spoilers. Also, because we are not in Navarre today, we do not have any spoilers for Fourth Wing or Iron Flame. You get the point. We are spoiler-free.
Next warning, you know the drill. We are adults who say adult things about adult books.
I may or may not have asked Jennifer L. Armentrout the origin story of Honeydew. That is why we are in an adult content podcast here, friends. And now, let us interview this queen or princess, if you know, you know, of romantasy. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Fantasy Fangirls Podcast, Jennifer L. Armentrout. That's a cool sentence to say.
So while many of our listeners are already familiar with you and your books, we'll love to kick this off with a quick introduction about you and what's new right now.
First off, I want to say thank you guys for having me on today. I'm the author of, I think, Flesh and Fire, Fire in the Flesh, maybe if I could say the title correctly, is my 69th book that has come out. I find that to be a very appropriate number for the book. I've write across multiple genres. I've written in young adult, new adult, and adult. I've written paranormal, contemporary, mystery and suspense, and of course, fantasy. So my backlist is quite extensive. So I feel like for the most people, if there's something there that you will like to read, hopefully.
So, wow, your 69th book. How did you get into writing? When did you get into writing?
To sound cliche, I wanted to be a writer since I was a teenager. And I wrote my first book in algebra class, during algebra class, which is why I had to take remedial math in college. So I do not recommend that you do that.
I actually had to retake an algebra one as well because I was writing too many fan fictions.
Yes, yeah. It's like I'm not ever going to be adding up letters. So it's like I checked out immediately. So, but once I got into college, I went to college for like psychology and sociology with a criminal justice focus. Then it's like just a main psychology focus. I feel like a lot of times when you go to college, it's like really hard to read for enjoyment at that point because there's so much you're having to read, but also it's like you want to be going out and doing things in college too. Yeah. So it wasn't until I think they call them the aughts now. I feel so old. The 2000s, the aughts.
I was like, I don't know this.
What's the aughts?
I think that's the 2000s. And maybe it's the next ones, and I'm wrong about that, in the next decade. It wasn't until late 2000s that I had decided I want to try to do this. It's something I've always wanted to do. And it took a long time for me to put it out in submission because then it was real. It wasn't just something I was passing time with. So yeah, I started my journey in like 2008, 2009 timeframe. And then my first book ended up coming out in 2011. So it's been a little bit over, that's 12 years now. It's been a busy 12 years, but it's been a lot of fun. And for those who are like interested in the writing or technical side of it with publication, I'm what they call a hybrid author. And that means I have like active contracts with the New York publishers. There's 4 of them now, I think. And then I also publish with like small presses or independent presses. And sometimes I will self-publish. So that's usually the different methods that I do. So I do a mix of everything.
Do you have a personal preference or a favorite type?
There's really no actual preference for me. It all depends on what type of book I'm writing. So for me, if it's young adult, I typically will go the traditional route because teens still really they like physical copies, which is so odd because their own phones and stuff. You would think they'd be reading a lot of ebooks, but
I would have thought that, yeah.
But I think it's because for school when they're studying or reading, they're reading a physical book. So traditional publishers are really, keep in mind, there's always an outlier. This isn't the same for everybody, but they have better distribution with YA, but also you almost always need like a traditional publisher to get into libraries, like school districts, things like that with YA.
Mhm.
And so that is, so depending on the genre is how I decide. Romance, I tend to want to do like indie publishing on,
Yeah.
because it's publishing always has like a hard time on how to market it. It's something that you think they would have gotten a grasp on better, but so it just really, for me, it depends on the genre.
Other than, maybe like an algebra trope, what's your favorite trope to read? And then what's your favorite trope to write?
Yeah, an algebra trope. That would be the trope that would
leaning over X
bounce
plus
right out.
Y.
Yeah, just be like, nope. I think my favorite trope is probably the same one I like to write, which is like enemies to lovers. I think that
Yeah.
always, has the best chance for banter at that point.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And you have the push and pull effect more in that.
What about to read? Or is it,
It's the same. Yeah.
Oh, okay,
I'm a
perfect.
sucker for that type of trope. And like real enemies. Like and this is no shade like against like the enemies to lovers trope in contemporary, but I'm not like talking about like, oh, this is a rival coworker. No, like give me like assassins plotting against one another. Like I like there to be like stakes, like life and death stakes type of thing.
Love it. Well, that's what makes it extra interesting, right?
Yeah.
And then for someone new to your book series, I know there's multiple series, but we had a lot of our listeners ask, what is the best order for them? They want to start your series, they want to start getting immersed in your universe. And I've read online that to essentially do like a dual reading between these two series. What do you recommend?
So if you like fantasy, I would recommend you start with From Blood and Ash. Now, well, that's not necessarily true. Let me back up for a second. You can read Flesh and Fire before reading From Blood and Ash. It's not really going to spoil anything. However, it probably will allow you to pick up on things probably a lot quicker because you'll have the backstory and you would know what's happening. So the sixth book, I believe, in the Blood and Ash series is yet to come out. So the Flesh and Fire series will be finished before that book comes out. So you could read the Flesh and Fire series first and then jump into From Blood and Ash. So that starts with A Shadow in the Ember. But again, if you wanted to start with From Blood and Ash, you can start with that and then go back and read the Flesh and Fire. So it really depends on like, what you're kind of in the mood for. The Blood and Ash series, I will say, is a larger series. It's more of the world. In that series, you see a lot of the kingdoms. You see like the Wolven, which I know a lot of people like, that you don't see in Flesh and Fire. But the Flesh and Fire, you see all the Drakens, which are the dragons. So it's like you have to like.
I love the
respect-
Drakens.
Yeah. And you may eventually see them pop up in the Blood and Ash series. But so it depends on like what you're in the mood for, like kind of. I do say the Blood and Ash world, I feel like is larger just because there's a lot more traveling. You're going to different places than you do in the Flesh and Fire series.
Amazing.
Very cool. Because that was what I had been learning. I've only read the very first From Blood and Ash book. And then it's like, okay, great. So I got like all of like, I had no spoilers. And it was like, and I'm not going to say anything on here because it's spoiler free, but And then I had seen actually is to then start reading the Flesh and Fire books, because then that kind of builds in more of that world building, even though it takes place, a few thousand years before From Blood and Ash, right?
Yeah. And it's like a prequel. Now, eventually, like, there's going to be some merging eventually. I foresee in that. But like, so it's a prequel. It's basically the reason I wrote this series is because I got to the point in Blood and Ash where, I knew that I needed to explain like the background of the gods and why don't you see the faces of the primal life or the god of life. And I always knew in my head, like, the truth behind that. And I was getting to the point in the series where I was going to have to explain that. And I thought, as I fleshed out that backstory, it was very interesting to me. And I could either basically info dump this backstory into Blood and Ash, or I could actually show the readers what had happened. Because I feel like if I just did the info dump, it's like you lose a lot of the emotion in that. Like it just loses a lot of context. Like
Yeah.
and it's hard to understand like when someone's telling you, oh, they had to do this. And of
Yeah.
course, it is something that you would be like, why would you do that though? But it's different when you actually read why certain decisions were made and choices. So that's when I decided to write that. I feel like most people, it's like most of the authors, like we tend to never write a prequel until we're writing the current series, which it'd be great if we got those ideas in different orders.
Well, out of curiosity, is it easy to write these two? Like, I don't know if you are writing the Six for Blood and Ash right now, but like, would it be easy to write these two worlds in tandem since they are in the same universe? I know you also just had a brand new book with a brand new universe just come out, which I believe I heard in an interview you were writing at the same time as Flesh and Fire. Like, is it easy to write in the same or different universes?
There's pros and cons to it. When it's within the same universe, it's like, or basically the same series. And I do combine Flesh and Fire and Blood and Ash as the same series in my mind. So when I say same series, I'm talking about like both of them. It is a little bit harder because you have to remember like which timeline you're in. It's like has something been introduced yet? And you can only remember, even something I've created, I can only remember so much. And, we do have Bibles, is what they call them, of like that copy editors usually create that kind of lists certain things that you have put into a book. And that's for the author, but it's also for them when they're checking for continuation and making sure you're not writing a plot hole. But that's a little bit harder because you're like, oh man, wait, what book is this in? And you're like, oh shit, wrong book.
Do you know how long your Bible is for
it's
the For
ridiculous.
Blood and Ash? I was going to say, I can only
It
imagine.
is. I printed it out and stopped like halfway through because I was like, okay, I'm going to run out of ink. I was like, it's so big. Yeah.
And after a certain point, like, oh man, I think about like the Control F, like
Yeah,
there's
that's what
certain functionality. It's just like, okay, yeah, oh
yeah,
my gosh.
yes. And I have sometimes like the Bible is so big, it can get a little bit cumbersome to search through. So I usually sometimes will just give up and go to the book and do Control F because I'm just like, oh, fuck it. Like, and just look for it. Yeah. Because it is a lot. And, because I think readers a lot of times think that like the author remembers everything. And I do think on my earlier books and there for the longest time, like I could just remember like all these different series. But after a while, it's like you just try to retain like what you're writing at that moment. Like when I was doing promo for Fall of Ruin and Wrath, I started writing the final book in the Flesh and Fire series, and that's what I'm finishing up now. And it was so hard to switch, like because I've already at that point forgotten everything. It felt like what was in that book. It's like because I had to switch my head so much to a
Yeah.
different thing, and it is hard. Yeah, like when you're in a different book, like to have to then talk about like another book. I am lucky right now that I'm still in the Flesh and Fire, that it's easy for me to talk about it. But again, I have to be careful that I'm not talking about what is actually in the current book that I'm working on.
I was just about to ask that question because, and Nicole knows this, I am really bad about saying spoilers, like if I'm reading a book ahead of her or
Drives me
something like
crazy.
that. And I don't think I'm saying a spoiler, but apparently it is a spoiler. And it's like, wow, how do you keep track of that?
Yeah, it is hard. Like I have to stop sometimes and be like, but it's funny. I'm probably like you, where I like spoilers don't personally bother me. Like I don't. There's been very few times that I've seen a spoiler for something and then I didn't watch the movie or show or didn't read the book. But also, there's a lot of things that people consider spoilers that I don't like. I know some people who are like, I don't even want to know if something cool happens in this chapter. And I'm just kind of, I stop like
That's
with you.
me.
So yeah. And I'm always like, that's not really, you don't know what's going to happen though. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Like, but I get it. On the flip side, it's because now you're like, well, I know something's going to happen.
It always
but
helps
yeah.
because I'm normally a book or so ahead of Lexi.
It's the coolest thing I feel about fantasy is that fantasy books have a long tailwind, meaning they continue, and not always, but sometimes you get lucky, and they continue to sell years later at a higher than normal sales volume for something that has been out for a couple of years. But what happens then is that you have these new readers coming in who have kind of scanned the reviews on all the books, right? So they're so confused. I have a Facebook group that a lot of the readers are in, and there'll be some people who are reading it though who will like do a post and be like, "Oh, like keep reading." But yeah, it's like I don't know how people when they do buy I guess they probably either like the first book and then maybe just buy the next book without really reading the description and the blurb. Because if you really don't like to be spoiled, you almost have to do it that way, because
Yeah.
eventually it's like you can, when we do the blurbs or the publisher does the blurbs, like they try not to spoil the previous books, but there always gets to a point in a series where it's like the blurb will just be like, buy my book. Like you can't say anything. So you have to like
Yes.
be like, okay, well, you shouldn't be looking at book 4 if you haven't read book 1. Like,
At that point, you're just
yeah,
choosing violence.
yeah,
Like,
right.
that's your
Like,
own fault.
like yeah, it's like I can't help you help yourself. Don't look at this book. Like some people do, and so but there's little that you can do at that point about that.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the book community, we opened up to our community of what questions do you guys want to hear from Jennifer? We actually got a lot of them. So we picked some really some highlights.
It said we had discovered some of your super fans, and so we reached out to them personally, and they were so excited to be part of this. So from Cassie, what helps you write and get the creative juices flowing?
I think for me, it's the most unmotivational thing I can ever say to a person, because I think like everybody thinks that like, oh, you write for like this, I don't know, inspiring reason. But in reality, I bore very easily. And so writing entertains me. So like
Yeah.
I do have like ADHD. If you see how I move constantly, taking glasses off, putting them on, very fidgety. So like I have to get something and do something that keeps my attention. So I'm a type of person that cannot sit still. Like if people follow me who listen to this podcast, you might have seen that I repainted like fireplaces. That's what I do. Like, and I'll do that.
Amazing.
People are like, "How do you have time to do that?" I was like, I was up until 2 o'clock in the morning, hating my life, because for some reason I didn't want to sit still for an hour and go to bed at a normal time. I decided to do this instead. But like for me, it entertains me. But also, I've always believed books are escape for people. They're like little lifelines that are thrown out to people who may not need it, so they just use it as an escape. But then for other people, it's like life preservers that keep them afloat until they, are in a better place to get help or to address maybe whatever is happening in their life. And writing books are the same way, where it's like sometimes I just need an escape from the real world. I feel like that's constant nowadays, where you just like I just have to escape from everything that's happening. And other times it's, you just be in a bad headspace, but you can not really worry about that right now and disappear into this world. So that is really what drives my to write. And in terms of my creativity, things just pop into your head. You can see a commercial on TV, hear a song, like the Blood and Ash books. Like I got the idea for those books while watching the 2016 Summer Olympics.
I'm going to need some connecting of the
Yeah.
dots there,
Yes,
Jennifer.
me too.
Yeah, I'm like trying to. It's like, okay, what happened at the 2016?
Nothing. There was. That's when we learned that obviously Atlantis picked the play of Atlantis, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
I guess Atlantis was discovered during that. No, like it's just no. I have no idea to this day. I cannot answer why. And honestly, I'm one of those people that only watches like certain things on the Olympics, like the gymnastics. I'm there, and honestly, I think that's about it. It's like as a kid, I wanted to be a gymnast so bad, and that's just the ability to have your body spring 20 feet into the air like is just
Right.
like mind-boggling to me. I don't know why any of that gave me the idea. So it's really hard to say like where do I get the ideas. They just come to you, and then it becomes the game of, do I explode that further, or do I just put that away because it's not going to work? It's weird, or I'm weird.
Going off of that, like not only just like how do you not coming up with the ideas, but how do you keep yourself organized? Do you have like a crazy wall with maps and note cards and all of that, or do you
The
have
red
like
tape,
or is your computer just like has your entire universe all? Is it as organized as we might think it is, or?
So for the world that I'm working in, I do use heavily Apple Notes and journals. Like I do have journals, and many of them I never touch. I buy and I'm like, oh, it's pretty. And then I don't use it. But then I have certain ones that I do like to use for plotting out the last part of a book. Like usually when I get to like the end of the middle, I do have to sit down and start plotting, because that's where you typically get a little bit lost in the sauce of doing things. And you are kind of like, oh shit, this book's 200,000 words and I'm nowhere near the end of this book. And that's when you have to stop and be like, okay, what needs to happen? So I do have journals for that, but I just use mostly notes because it's everywhere. It's on your phone. If something pops in your head, it's on your computer. It's like, so I do a lot of keeping track of things in there. Like in Blood and Ash, obviously Poppy tastes people's emotions. So there's only certain emotions that I can remember off the top of my head, even now. Like that and sometimes I do remember, but I'm not confident that I'm right. So, like, every time I start a new book in the Blood and Ash series, I bring over that ability sheet. And so, just to make, because it's easy, I can just literally just flip right down at the bottom and go look and be like, oh, yes, concern is like thick cream. And so it's stuff like that where it's like sometimes I do remember it, but I'm not 100% confident in that I do.
On that same note, then I have a question around that poppy power.
I do like
the
puppy
taste.
power.
The puppy power.
I was like, puppy power.
That's like Powerpuff right there.
Yeah.
How do you come up with the taste for these emotions? Because as I'm reading Blood and Ash, like she'll say like chocolate and berries, and I'm like, I can feel that. Yep, I resonate with that. You know, how do you come up with those?
So I approached it. What would I think it tasted like for certain things, and then for ones I wasn't sure, I would look at foods associated with love or comfort. Like I would kind of, for things I wasn't sure, I would look that way too. Or a lot of my stuff is like heavily Greek inspired, like Greek mythology. So if I really get stuck, then I'll say, okay, love, I'll go look at Aphrodite and look at symbols. And when you start falling down some rabbit holes, you'll see that there's some rabbit holes plummet into with Greek mythology.
We are familiar with those rabbit holes with
Like,
this podcast.
I can only
In the
imagine
world
how,
where
as
they
an
can-
author, yes.
Yeah. Can't, like, people run away from gods and turning themselves into trees. It is like, I'm not sure what that's supposed to teach me, but like, yeah, it's so I will look even at that because sometimes you can find things, but most of them I kind of thought, what would that feel like? What would that taste like? Like I always thought like fear would have, like, there would be like a bitterness, like or like a sourness that you would probably taste. And one of the reasons why I chose that as a way to do it is because one thing in books as an author, it's like you have to remember like there's just more than one sense of talking and hearing and speaking, and you always have to, like, there's smells, there's taste, and sometimes as you're writing you forget that, oh, do they smell anything right now? Do they taste anything? And that's where one of the ideas that came to me is like, oh, I think people can relate emotions to taste and things like that. So that is kind of where I came up with that. But like concern, I thought would be like thick. Like you would, when you're concerned, you feel heavy, weight it down, anxiety. It's like, so it's like kind of looking at how you feel and what type of foods I could associate with that or tastes I could associate with it.
That's brilliant. Well, okay, so speaking of your characters, who are some of your favorite characters to write and why?
And spoiler free, yeah.
Yeah, if we're able to.
I feel like I like all my characters and I hate them all equally. Basically, you ask the question about where I'm at in writing the book. If I'm starting at writing it, I love them. They're so great. And then if I'm where I'm at now, I'm like, I'm just going to kill all of them. Every single one. Spoiler. It's like twist. Now you have a whole new book.
I have to ask you this. Have you ever gotten so mad at a character yourself that you actually did kill them off?
Yeah, I have. I don't know if I could say that, but I have, like, actually no, because there's been characters that, like, I was like, oh, I'm going to kill this character off. But then when I get to that point, I'm like, I realize that doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't have the emotional impact for that character. And then I have to kill one of the ones I don't actually want to kill off because I enjoy their character. Some people who have read my older books probably literally know characters I'm talking about, and that's a little bit hard, like, just because you're like, oh man, I enjoy writing that character. But in terms of characters, I do enjoy writing my main characters, but I do have fun with the side characters because like they are almost like, I don't want to say like a comedic break, but like I like to have the side characters really have their own personalities. And I don't really realize it as I'm writing them. Like, I don't want to say they don't matter, right? But it's like I'm not really focused on them as much as I am the main characters. But then the readers will really latch on to these characters that you really didn't think of. Like, you weren't thinking a lot about them. And I think a lot of times it's because those characters do have like either humor or like really sarcastic, really dry personality. I know a lot of people like Kieran for that because he is like the perpetual babysitter. Like,
he's my favorite.
Yeah, like,
I love
like,
Kieran.
He needs a raise for all he has to deal with. But then there's a character Reaver who you do get to see younger. and him and Jadis are like younger Drakens or dragons, and like I model them after my dogs, how they behave, like when they're in their Draken form. Just chaos ensues. But those are the type of characters that I do really enjoy because it's more of like fun writing because it's like I get to write them in as a like a little break from seriousness that's happening, stuff like that.
Oh, from Christine, what gave you the idea for Blood and Ash / Flesh and Fire universe?
I was watching the 2016 Olympics.
Oh,
and
that's right. Yes.
Yeah, it took me 3 years to write that book because I was a bit intimidated by writing high fantasy because I hadn't written it before. And it is a lot different than writing like what I call contemporary fantasy, like my Dark Element series or the Covenant series, where it's like you have, especially the dark elements more so because that is the world we live in, but there are gargoyles and people are aware of them and it's okay. And because you're using the world we exist in as your backdrop. So you're not having to explain anything. But when you do epic fantasies, it's like every little tiny piece of knowledge that you normally would not think twice about, you do have to think about because it's like, how do they communicate? How do they travel? Can you really send shit by carrier pigeon? I know it's a thing, but I'm like, I don't understand how that happens. Like,
I want to know how these pigeons are taught. And the owls as well.
Yeah,
Yes.
no, and it's stuff like that where you do have to like take into consideration, and that is intimidating because it's like you can have a great like characters and whatever, but have a world that makes absolutely no sense. That can be very distracting to a reader. So it took a while for me to flesh it out and to write it. And as I was writing the Blood and Ash series, that's when I decided that I needed to write Flesh and Fire. Because instead of just doing the info dump of their backstory, I wanted to know it.
Yeah. And do you have any specific examples of real life experiences that have contributed to the shaping of this universe?
How many times have you been at Atlantis, Jennifer?
It's so funny because like I always feel like Disney has ruined the myth of Atlantis because everybody thinks of it as like mermaids or some shit floating around down there. Or even like I don't know if Aquaman is based on Atlantis myth either. I'm not sure.
I think so.
Yeah.
I say that with very little confidence, though.
Yeah, but
I just know of it as that one like cartoon movie where they're looking for Atlantis, and I don't remember anything else besides that.
Like
I think Atlantis as your Atlantis.
Yeah, I think
it's always underwater.
Yeah, it's because it's sunk into the sea. Like people didn't survive that. Like if Atlantis existed, which supposedly it did. Like, I don't know. I think probably what happened is that there was something like Atlantis that existed. And because, when you look back at ancient texts, like they describe things in such fanciful ways that like it's easy to interpret certain things. But yeah, that's what Disney did. It completely changed them. I feel like it was Disney because I remember one of them had like a bubble over it or something.
Yep.
Those people were dead. Like, like they sunk into the ocean. I remember falling down this like rabbit hole of it, where they do believe that there probably was another nearby island or something. And then based on the writings, and it has something to do with the thing that, oh my gosh, the pillars of something, that there probably was a earthquake that destroyed most of that island. That something similar to that did exist, but it probably wasn't as we know today Atlantis. But yeah, Disney completely has everyone believe in they're like mer people living under the sea or something, which I just imagine what Greek mythology would, the Greek people back then would have called that. They'd be like, there's not enough insane stuff happening for that to keep our attention. But yeah, I was very inspired by that and in shaping, and I've always been fascinated with that. So that helped shape a lot of that. So I think that could be my only like experience really is my fascination with Greek mythology. Yeah. But there are small things like that. I think like Syrah in Flesh and Fire deals with anxiety, and I have anxiety, and so I mean in depression. So she deals with both. She deals with both. Which one is the main one, right? Because sometimes, not always, one is causing the other. Because you want to address that main one first because you treat the symptoms, but not it's like you're not getting anywhere, and that's something I have experience with. And right now I'm like, I don't believe you if you say you don't have anxiety at this point. Like
100%.
Yeah. Or like, what drugs are you on? And can you share? Because
give me a list.
It's working. But it's, because I feel like being said is that there for the longest time, and even now I think we are getting better, but whenever you would have a character who would have like chronic disease or disorder, whether it be mental or physical, that is in books the sum of who they are. It's like,
Yeah.
and and a lot of times when you read books that would have mental health things in it, is everything is shown as toxic, or like how the mental health ruined this, how it shaped that. And it's like, what kind of message are we sending people? Like
Yeah.
that, it's like, if you have depression, anxiety, if you have bipolar, borderline, something like that, it's like, you're never going to have a happy, you're never going to have a relationship. And, what I wanted to show in that is that, like, you can have this and still be a badass. Like, you can still go out there and fight because it's a part of who you are. It's not the sum of who you are. And I do think we're getting better on that. But if you really stop and think about, over the last several decades, like, how many books had characters in it who had that, and it was a romance, meaning it had a happily for now or happily ever after. And it wasn't like incredibly toxic, or like, just, we didn't see it. And I do, again, think we're getting better, but I think that's a little bit of me experiences, and also coming from a psychology background. It's like, I do think that helps reduce the a little bit, just a tiny bit,
Yeah.
just with the
Absolutely.
stigma of stuff.
Well, and I see that in Poppy's superpower, because like that, I won't spoil it, but that is something that, as someone who does very much have similar tendencies, I've never seen a character be represented as a female main character with that, nevertheless, even as a superpower.
Yeah.
And so to be able to see that as such a, like, no, this is massively beneficial, that was just like, oh my God, so cool to read.
And I think with Poppy, it's like, it can be overwhelming to her, because I imagine it's like
Yeah.
an empath, right? A person who's
Yeah.
just really in tune to other people's feelings. It's like, that has to be overwhelming. I
It
do
is.
think, yeah. And in the Blunt Ash world, you do see that when it starts to become too much. And
Yeah.
and then in the Flesh and Fire, Sarah, it's her learning certain techniques and how to recognize, like, when what we would call an anxiety attack, because in a fantasy world they wouldn't probably call it a panic attack, something like that, but
Yeah.
learning to recognize that. And because there are coping things that can be beneficial, like keeping busy, as long as it's keeping busy doing healthy things,
Right.
can be beneficial. And so it's learning how to cope, with that kind of stuff. So this is something I always try to work in there, because it's something that I just don't think, again, that you see a lot of.
I was just going to say, and then also, I'm not saying to have those, I'll say, weaknesses turn into strengths, but like you were saying there, with them being able to cope with it and to be the badasses that they are, they usually do have to overcome and learn how to cope. They have to tap into some kind of strength that they do have because of their experiences and how they are in this way.
Yeah, I want to say, and again, I like put my little psychology hat on. We do a lot of policing on how we phrase things and how we talk about things. And ultimately, a lot of times when we do that unintentionally, from the best places of ourselves, we end up silencing people, because the way that people naturally talk about, especially in mental health, when they're starting out in it, right, and they're starting to recognize that they have a problem, they're going to consider it a weakness. They're not going to call it like, a possible future strength. And they're going to think something's wrong with it. They're going to feel like something's wrong. And you would see people being like, oh, you can't talk like that. It's like, first off, a psychologist would never say that to somebody. Like, and again,
Yeah.
I get that you're coming from a good place, but there are ways that we naturally tend to think of ourselves. And you don't feel like it's a strength, especially when you're really in the thick of it, right? Like, when you really, because I do think a lot of times, like, you go a long time without realizing that there's something going on. I don't know if it ever becomes like a strength to people, but the thing is, they become stronger, that person.
Exactly.
And
That's the way. Yep.
and they learn how to adapt. These are things that sometimes, like, some anxieties are environmentally caused, just like depression, or things that are happening, but others, it's never going to go away. Like, you're going to live every day with this. So you learn how to live with it, and you're going to have good days, you're going to have bad days, whether you're on medication or not. And I feel like that is where the person becomes stronger, because you have to still keep going, even when it doesn't feel like you can. And you have to come above that. And so that's where I think the strength comes in. It comes in with that person still getting up the next day. And because that is, if you have something, you've dealt with it, or someone, that sometimes can feel impossible for people to do. And, and that does require a lot of strength.
Definitely. I know we're coming up on time, so we do have a few more questions we want to ask. It was announced earlier this year that For Blood and Ash is being developed into an Amazon show. First of all, fucking congratulations. That is so epic and cool. What was it like to learn that news?
It was exciting. I mean, but I don't let myself get too excited because like I've been through many, many shins that have just petered out. That is 99% of them are going to go nowhere. That is just what happens in this industry. But you do get excited because
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff that I couldn't talk about that was happening before Amazon Studios acquired it. It was with a relatively pretty well-known producer for a long time, and well, not a long time, but for a while. And but then he couldn't take it because he ended up doing something else. And once, yeah, I learned what it was. I was like, oh, I completely understand. I would do that too. Amazon came a knocking, and I talked to them. I remember the call. I got on a Zoom call with all of them, and it was really funny too because there's like two other people on the call named Jennifer, so it was just like nobody knew like who you were
The
talking to.
battle of the
Yeah.
Jennifers.
But one thing I loved about it is the main guy who oversees everything. Every other person was a woman on the Zoom call, like the leads of all, and these were like their top people of each of those departments. And he kind of stepped aside and let them talk. And that right there
Yes.
immediately, like, okay, I like this because he knows and recognizes that, yes, Amazon Studios, basically what also happened is that they kind of realized that they didn't have anything really in their lineup at that time, except for one or two things, a very small percentage that really went after women viewers, who really went after that. Like they did have, obviously The Summer I Turned Pretty was coming out and showed them that there's a huge audience for this, like, and Outlander and stuff like that, where they were like, we want that. At the same time, we want to appeal to everyone, and I think with Blood and Ash and some of the other fantasy they've recently acquired, there is that other appeal of like action, things like that they bring in. But I really like that they took the helm and listening to them talk, and eventually the screenwriter they brought in and the producers, they knew what to focus on. Like they knew what was important, because ultimately when you do go into an option, you often can be listed as a producer. That's cool, but that's usually like a pat on the head,
Thanks for your contribution.
yeah. And
You
like
did a good
we'll ask
job.
a question, but we've already made up our minds, like type of thing. So, and that's not
Yeah.
the case all the time. But usually, like when you're author as an executive producer, I always feel like you have like one thing that you can die on, but you have to loosen the reins because then they will just stop
Yeah.
working with you. So, but it was very exciting. Hopefully that it'll continue. Things have been delayed with the strikes, and rightfully so because some of those
Yeah.
contract
Yep.
things are insane. But hopefully it gets picked back up and we'll see something.
Congratulations. I will speak for both of us and say we are foaming out the mouth to watch it. So excited.
And then just our last question here, we call you the queen of romantasy on BookTok, and we just what is it like having such a big following? Not I'll say BookTok, Bookstagram, just on social media and being, I'll just say it, a big powerhouse on there. And how in the world do you manage your inbox? Because we need tips.
So I feel like that title of the queen, I don't know if you can hear my dogs, they're barking. I feel like that title that has to be shared. There, to be like,
yes, absolutely.
yeah, there are many, many of them who I feel like are right up there and can share that title. I like to call myself a princess of it. I feel
Okay,
like,
Hawk.
We'll just go in the mass verse, and
yeah,
you can be one of the 6 queens.
yes,
There
and
you go.
I feel, yeah, it's like I'll be like one of them, but I don't think of as you could probably tell, I don't think of myself as that. Like I don't think of myself as a powerhouse of anything. So other than procrastination, that I'm probably a powerhouse of. But I kind of live by this mantra. I've been very lucky with having these extremely high moments in my career. Like Wait for You was one of them. Or the Luck series was another where it's like I felt like holy shit, I've made it. I've made it. Especially Wait for You when it hit #1 on the New York Times list. I was like, I made it. And then all the other books, I had this notion that if you hit the New York Times list that high, you're just going to continue. Because shocking news, the New York Times is not based on actual sales. It's based on sales from certain places. So it's not an actual representation of someone's sales. It's where they're coming from,
Yeah.
and they're weighted differently. Some of the books that came out after Wait for You did well, was on the list. And then it started, like, it didn't collapse, but you could see like just a decline. Like most people's careers are like hilly, they go up and down. But
Right.
I've been lucky that I feel like I've had it happen once, twice, and then 3 times with Blood and Ash. And knowing that this sad reality is that doesn't happen once for most authors. Like it just doesn't. And to have it happen is, I feel like, very humbling because I know like that I didn't start off with a big deal, right? Who their first book went to auction, blockbuster deal, and I kind of pull, myself up in the industry. So
Yeah.
I kind of stick that way because again, it's like I always feel like if you start believing your own hype is the moment things go sideways. And really the moment where your books just they're shit at that point because you really stop trying. And so I don't ever let myself look at it that way because I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like you just would be a really like shitty person to be around. Like, just in my
No,
opinion.
I don't.
Yeah.
that makes absolute sense. And I'm
Yeah.
sure that it's also just like you have so much going on where it's almost like you got to kind of keep that tunnel vision in its
Yeah.
own way
Yeah.
to stay focused on the outcome, which is the good writing, which is these good
Yeah.
character developments and plots and all of that.
Because like a lot of people like will say like I don't read negative reviews because they can get stuck in your head, and that's true. But what you also don't know is positive reviews can also get stuck in your head because when you do have a larger readership, it's like you start thinking, oh, how do I keep them? It's like you can't do it. Like, and when you write, you can't keep everyone happy. But like when you really think about how many people are reading your book, it does get a little like, oh no, but what if you start thinking about things you cannot think about when you're writing because you just
Yeah.
end up spinning your heels the whole time, like trying to
Well,
satisfy people.
and going back to our previous conversation about killing off characters that you might be mad at, and then sometimes you do realize that you have to, for the emotional impact for the story to move forward, you have to get rid of a character who people would like. And I'm sure that when that happens, there's a little bit of an edge, like, oh geez, they're gonna be mad
I'm
at
about to
me.
piss some people off.
Yeah, yeah. And some people do get upset, but usually when that happens, like people are more sad than they are angry, at least from what I've
Exactly.
personally
Yeah.
seen. Usually when they make people angry is messing with who they decided the love interest should be. And then that
Yep.
can be like, ooh, it gets scary out there in the internet. And you've seen it like happen also in like other books where it's just like it's it can become a thing because people do get really attached to the characters. I mean, and honestly, like some readers who've gotten angry about that kind of stuff would not probably like to admit this, but that is to say something about that author writing that character. Those, you know what I mean? So real that this does feel like
Yeah.
real people to you. And so I think that's a testament, either to your writing or your storytelling.
Oh, that's a beautiful way of looking at it. I
I
love
love
that.
that. That's a very half full kind of way of looking at it. I love it.
As you're rocking in the corner and, not
Holding
going
a
onto the
dog
internet.
for comfort.
No.
Well, Jennifer, we have one last question for you, and this is a spoiler for Blood and Ash, but I could not sit down with you and not ask this question because it's become a regular joke on the
think I'm
podcast
familiar
of honeydew.
with that.
How the hell did you come up with honeydew?
Well, it's funny because like I like read a lot of historical romance when I was a teenager because when I was a teenager there wasn't a huge young adult section. It was just like R.L. Stein, L.J. Smith, Christopher Pike, and that was about it. So I ended up reading historical romance, and it was like the old school legitimate bodice rippers, like Joanna Lindsay, like things like that. Often you would read that like there will always be this like just insane taste, like where I'm like the person does not taste like strawberries down there. Like, come on. Or like even now in some contemporary romances, like there will you will see that attributed. And it was me like poking fun at ourselves because we write things that are impossible in that sense. And so it was really started off as just me being silly. And one thing I don't take myself that seriously. And I don't mean this in a bad way. I don't take my fantasy that serious. I like to have fun with it. And it was like if people, for example, are in my reader group, like if they start catching on to something, like one of the things was casserole, and so they would started saying it was a casserole, and so I had wrote that into one of the books, and so I'll do that sometimes just to have fun. And that's what Honeydew was, just like me being silly. I never expected people to latch onto that as much. But I think it's because it's like Honeydew, really?
Yeah. I was like, is she just really into that particular
Yeah,
melon?
like I think I maybe have had honeydew once. Like I can't even remember, like to be honest with you. But it was really me just like also and not so much poking fun, but more of like doing a nod to the writing style that kind of came before. And that was just something, if you read any of the old school historicals, it's almost always in the books would be a taste. And that's just something that just stuck in my head, and I decided it would be a funny thing. And then it just became a thing at that point.
Perfect. That is the best answer I could have ever hoped for. Thank you. Oh my God. Jennifer, thank you so much for being here with us today. This has been a dream to talk to you. I have a copy of this book right here, which came out last week, A Fire in the Flesh, which is the third in your Flesh and Fire series. You also had A Fall of Ruin and Wrath come out. I cannot wait to get my hands on that book, but you've been busy, ma'am. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
That was amazing. I'm speechless. That was incredible. If you want to get your hands on one or a plethora of Jennifer's books, we've got the Amazon storefront with a kit and caboodle of her books in our show notes, or if you're watching on YouTube, in the caption.
And when you do order from our Amazon shop, it's absolutely no extra cost to you, and you are directly supporting Fantasy Fangirls. So if you're going to buy, please do buy us from us.
That just sounds like a win-win, and you make Lexi and I very happy, and we cry with joy. We know you are eager for more Fourth Wing content, and Iron Flame content. Here is an exciting surprise.
We are releasing our deep dive on Xaden's point of view chapters tomorrow.
Was that Annie tomorrow? Was that your Annie tomorrow?
Tomorrow.
There was a reason one of us got the musical theater degree. Wow. We will be getting into Xaden's head and sparring on the mat with Violet, and then in his head after threshing. And oh my God, we cannot wait.
And then, of course, if you need a quick refresher, November 20th, we are starting our Iron Flame deep dive, unless you're a dragon rider with our Patreon, in which you get it on the 19th. Hey. Speaking of Patreon,
Fantasy Fangirls is now on Patreon, in case you missed it. You asked, we listened, we have decked out this Patreon beyond belief. So you not only have access to more Fantasy Fangirls content, but you are also supporting Lexi, myself, the whole Fantasy Fangirls team in one of the best and most direct ways possible.
And so real quick, there's 2 tiers for the Patreon. First, we have our cadet level, which includes access to our Discord server and a monthly live Q&A with us.
We just had our November live this past weekend. We were all up in Iron Flame, you betcha. But you can still receive the on-demand recording of it if you join today.
And also at this cadet level, you get a special 20% off the Fantasy Fangirls merchandise store. And this cadet tier is $5 a month.
But then if you are post-threshing, you've taken down people on the mat, you've been inside Xaden's head during sparring lessons, and you've bonded not one but 2 dragons, we have our Dragon Riders tier. This includes access to the Discord, the Q&As every single month, the discounted merch store, all of the things from the cadet level, but you also get access to all future deep dive episodes a full day early. Like we said, you get access to the Iron Flame deep dive a full day early. We know you guys are so excited, just like we are, to get that out into the world. You also get special voting privileges on things like interview questions. A lot of the interview questions that we had for this interview with Jennifer L. Armentrout were actually voted on by our Dragon Riders. Thanks, guys. You also get to help us pick archive topics. Iron Flame deep dives are coming up. We have a whole new slew of archives that our Dragon Riders are going to help us pick. And you'll also be voting on so much more. And last but not least, with our Dragon Riders, you get access to every single one of Lexi and I's episode outlines for our deep dive episodes. Yes, those ones that are 30, 40 pages long, you get all of them. And this Dragon Rider tier is $10 a month.
We understand that not everyone might be in a position to support, and that's totally fine. But if you are and you enjoy this content, you want more of it, plus you want to support Nicole, me, and the team, we would so appreciate when you join our Patreon.
The link is in the show notes, or if you're watching on YouTube, it's in the caption. You all, your support has meant flipping everything to us on this journey, and we cannot wait to get started on Iron Flame with you all soon. But until then, we'll see you tomorrow for Xaden's POV chapters.
Bye!